Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's webinar, which asks the question as to whether food and beverage in hotels is a loss maker or a value driver. Now, this has been a question that's long been a debate for 20, even 30 years. But since COVID and since the pandemic, research is showing that the consumer and guests are looking for stronger experiences. So the question needs to be asked whether food and beverage today plays a more central role. This webinar has been brought to you by a combination of HVS, Bird & Bird, AlixPartners and EP, and we're delighted to welcome you. So I do hope you enjoy the next 90 minutes. I think it's going to be really insightful and raise lots of questions that we can look for answers for. Look, and I love this topic because it has been a debate for 20, 30 years with many differing views. But are we seeing some change now? Now, food and beverage may not make as much profit as rooms does, but it does add to the guest experience and does interact with local communities. And actually, one of the questions often asked is whether sometimes hotels do enough with the local community, and is that a way of interacting? Question mark. The food and beverage sector has shown great growth over the last 10 years, over the last decade, and guests now do possess incredibly high expectations for the level of service they expect to encounter, as well as the choice that they expect to see in food and drink. And you can see that across not just hotels, but across venues, theatres, cinema, everything. The bar has risen. So is this a discussion that we do need to have more so in hotels too? It's evolving all the time. And we've seen a real shift since COVID, as guests do expect not just to see a raise in the bar and service, but actually bespoke services. And new questions are being asked all the time of all operators. So how are we reacting to those questions? We're delighted to welcome a whole range of expert speakers today who are going to guide you through this topic. And it really should be very insightful. We're delighted to welcome Sir David Michels, Andrew Stembridge, Laura Brickman, Paolo Panetti, as well as our normal, obviously stable speakers in terms of Graeme Smith, Managing Director of AlixPartners, Karen Friebe and James Fowler from Bird & Bird, and of course, Russell Kett, Chairman of HVS. So it should be an excellent next 90 minutes. Now, you will have questions to ask, so please use the Q&A and chat at the bottom and ask the question, and we promise we'll try and get back and answer all questions either during the session or after. So rest assured. Now we'd like to always open with a number of poll questions. So Izzy, can I ask you to raise the poll questions? It always helps to set the scene. Question 1, how much percentage departmental profit, i.e. before deduction of overheads, does your F&B operation currently make? More than 25%, 16 to 25%, 16 to 15%, 0 to 5%. Thank you. You're obviously going for all the questions, but good. How much percentage departmental profit should your F&B operation make? Really interesting. What do you feel would be the most effective means of driving profit in your F&B operation? Adjusting pricing, adjusting staffing, rebranding, outsourcing, extending license, something else. Some interesting answers coming through. How likely are you to outsource your hotel's F&B operation? What do you perceive the biggest challenge to outsourcing your hotel's F&B operation is likely to be? And some really interesting answers begin to come through. We will share these as well with you, because obviously these will continue to change over the next few minutes as well. With some very interesting answers beginning to emerge there. And obviously there seems to be a gap there between what is being made in terms of profit and what is expected, which is obviously going to be a heart of this discussion as we go through it. Thank you, Izzy. And we'll come back to those polls perhaps a bit later on to show you as well. May I first then introduce Graeme Smith, Managing Director of AlixPartners, to come and chat and talk to you. Good morning, Graeme.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome everybody to joining the webinar today. Let me just share my screen with everybody. Okay, just check, Chris. Can you see that now?
Yep, absolutely. It's absolutely fine.
So welcome everybody. So I'm Graeme Smith, Managing Director at AlixPartners, and as well as spending my time advising companies and investors in the hotel sector, I also spend a lot of my time working with restaurant businesses and bar businesses. So what we thought it might be helpful for today's discussion is to maybe give some perspectives of what I'm seeing with clients in that broader restaurant and bar market, and maybe draw some parallels as to what that impact might be for hoteliers. So first of all, just picking up in terms of what have we seen in relation to consumer behaviours, and how have they developed and changed in recent years? Well, the first thing is, pleasingly, encouragingly, the propensity and desire to eat and drink out remains incredibly strong. There were concerns as we went through this period of a cost of living crisis that people really cut back on their eating and drinking out expenditure. But we found actually demand has been resilient, and if anybody has been out certainly around London and tried to go into a bar or get a booking in a restaurant, you will see that everything is absolutely full, which is great in the face of some of the challenges in the background. What we have seen though is, whilst overall spending has proved resilient, in more recent months we have seen a bit of a shift where customers have been very much protecting what we would call occasion-led spending. So those planned events, things that people want to celebrate and enjoy, but perhaps less so on the more everyday trips to the restaurants and things like that. So we've seen a little bit that volumes are down, but the spend per visit is up. And what's important about that is to understand that this then feeds into the premiumization trend. So operators very much focusing on, when you do get customers into your venue, then being able to optimize that spend per visit. So the premiumization of food and drink has been quite a trend. Also, what is clear is that consumers really value the experience of eating and drinking out. So it's those things that really can't be replicated in the home environment. So they are focusing very much on, you know, what is different about eating and drinking out relative to being in the home, and not only the experience of being out together, but also then creating what we would call these kind of shareable moments. So those images and events which you can share on social channels. And this is important not just for the customer, but also for the venue themselves, because what a number of venues have been very successful at is making their customers almost their own marketing channel. So when customers are sharing their experience at the venue, that's then helping to drive awareness and further visitors to that venue itself, which has proved to be very successful. But also that it's created a greater focus on just the visual aspects of a restaurant or a bar, because the sharing aspect of it is a very visual event. What we've also seen is some of this blurring between work time and leisure time, and what that's doing is changing some of the usage patterns. So a little bit of the extension of the weekend, with that very much work from home on a Friday, potentially also on a Monday as well. So being able to shift some of that demand perhaps from the city centre on a Friday into some of the more suburban areas, or people taking longer weekend breaks but working from a location on a Friday rather than being in the office. And what that's done is, yes, it's changed some of those demand patterns, but also increased the importance of certain things like, you know, Wi-Fi connectivity, and also the ability to serve customers throughout the day, and not just in the traditional, you know, kind of meal times through breakfast, lunch, dinner, and drinks. Again, we'll come on to some of the opportunities that gives to hoteliers in a moment. We've also seen from a customer perspective very much this desire for authentic cuisine. So to understand that as customers have become more savvy, more educated about what they eat and what they drink, they want to know that that is authentic. And actually what we've seen a lot within certainly the restaurant sector is a lot of, you know, new operators springing up around a particular cuisine, and having a clear articulation of what the origin story is. Where's it come from? Why the food that's being served is authentic, and that building that into an element of actually the brand itself. And the final point just to raise around those trends is that the propensity for customers to go out but actually not want to drink alcohol has increased significantly. Some really interesting data that came out very recently this week around actually up to about 50% of customers would say that they have gone out with the express intention not to drink alcohol. So the being able to cater for low and no alcohol drinks is now really, really important from a venue perspective, and in terms of meeting those customer desires and expectations. So what we have seen is, yes, customer demand is resilient, but absolutely the customer is becoming more demanding and expects more, both from the experience point of view, but also from a value perspective. So how are we seeing hoteliers evolve their F&B offers to take advantage of these developing consumer patterns? Well, first of all, I think we have seen this increase in the creation of what we would call statement spaces. So looking for opportunities to have roof terraces, really investing in the communal spaces like lobby bars, and then looking to create those areas which really do photograph well, can be have photos taken by customers and shared on social channels that really help to promote the event itself, as well as being positive for the consumer. Also curating those propositions to be authentic to the location that the hotel is in. When you're not tied to a particular brand of a restaurant, then you can tailor the restaurant to be very specific to the location itself. But not only that, for the hoteliers, yes, your guests may well eat in your restaurant and drink in your bar, but quite likely as well, they want to go out and enjoy the local environment as well. So hotels really being able to play that gateway role into the local market and help their guests to be able to enjoy that area, as well as being enjoying the F&B in their own location. And then utilising those open plan areas to cater for flexible workers. So what areas can people sit down, have their laptop, do video calls, make calls, but be able to service them with food and drink and coffee through that period, maybe creating quieter areas to allow that to happen. Again, just ways to bring people in from outside, but also capture more of that guest spend when you're on premise. Also around that, hotels have typically a great deal of space, and what can they do to use that space to actively host and promote events. We've definitely seen from a consumer perspective the demand to go to events, to experience new things. So I think hotels being able to play an active role in hosting different events through the week to really make the use of the space that they've got available, again, bringing in external customers and also to service their own guests. But also, I think what's been quite important is for hoteliers to really step back and look at their F&B provision. Is it a differentiator in the market? Does it really drive demand to their sites? Is it what their customer wants? And is it economic? And we'll come on to some of the operational challenges that have been faced, because that position may have changed now compared to how it was pre-pandemic. And if it's not a differentiator, if it's not economic, well, actually, how can we strip that back so that it provides what the customer needs, but it doesn't waste money in that particular area? And also then, and I know that team at Bird & Bird will pick up on this as well, then looking at what aspect of the F&B provision can be or should be outsourced, in fact. So there have been certain challenges facing the industry from an operational standpoint that are driving operational change. So just to pick up on some of those, staffing absolutely continues to be a key challenge, both in being able to hire the right type of people, but then also the cost of those people, particularly in the UK, when we think about the national minimum wage and how that is increasing year on year and outstripping inflation. It's absolutely a key focus. Supply chain disruption from a food and beverage perspective, it has eased significantly. And inflation has come down, but it's quite category specific. So whilst we'll see deflation in some areas of the food supply chain, there are still some areas which are increasing ahead of general levels of inflation. Energy costs continue to be elevated in a much larger part of the P&L than they were previously. And also the need to comply with increasing regulatory aspects and compliance aspects. So this is also an area which, if you're operating your own F&B, has become a bigger focus. And finally, the point around sustainability and planet impact, right at the top of minds for consumers, investors, operators. So that also having to feed into how F&B provision is delivered within a hotel. And how is this driving operational change? Well, first of all, there are efforts to reduce labour content. You know, what can be automated? What is it the guests can do themselves? Menu flexibility. So the being able to respond to those challenges in the supply chain where particular food items are proving to be expensive, hard to obtain, and the ability to flex menu and substitute to be able to react to that is important. Also around digital tools. So again, feeds a little bit into efficiencies and labour content, but what can be done in terms of digital tools just from the customer journey, but then also from a back office perspective as well. And then investment in efficiency. So certainly when it comes to renovations, new builds, then the investment in certainly energy efficiency and also around from food and beverage provision, then what can be done to reduce food waste, energy usage during the preparation as well. So quite a lot of reactions that are happening operationally to deal with some of these market challenges. So just picking up on those operational challenges and what needs to be taken into account. It's very specific for the hotel market. The first point is around breakfast, a very critical meal in a hotel, quite often a buffet format. And if we think about the outsourcing aspect of it, then not terribly common factors within a normal restaurant environment, so the ability for an outsourced provider to deliver that. And also quite a lot of focus on, well, how much is the allocation to this, because quite often room rates are inclusive of the breakfast price. So people do focus on what is the allocation of that cost. Also on room service, I think people are taking a close eye to, is this offered? What periods is this offered? And is it in fact something which the guests need or want? For meetings and events, so this is important to look at how important to the overall revenues of the hotel are meeting and event revenues, and certainly from an operational standpoint, the ability to scale up and down from a staffing perspective, certainly in the face of some of those staffing challenges, is something that needs to be taken into account. And also, again, from an outsourced perspective, this is quite a specialist skill, and does that outsourced provider have the skills necessary to do that? And the final point really is the fact that there is this captive demand. You have the guests in the hotel, you know, they're there on site. How do you make the most of that captive demand? But also the fact that it helps to create perhaps different demand patterns than a restaurant operator would typically experience. Corporate customers being there in the early part of the week, but then having to shift that to more of a provision to a leisure customer as we head into the weekend. So again, more of a nuance that's particular to hotels than maybe a normal restaurant. So just in conclusion, things that we would draw people's attention to. So it's eating and drinking out is absolutely still in demand, which is really encouraging and great that we are in the end social creatures. There are changes in some of those consumer trends, so making sure that the F&B provision really is matched up to those new demands, and that's important to be able to drive value from this. This merging of business and leisure time, I do think, is an opportunity for hoteliers, the ability to have customers and guests on site for longer and spending more time in the venue itself. But also I think it's important to be able to step back and just reassess that F&B viability, given some of those operational challenges and pressures and cost increases that have taken place over the past few years, and really revisit that in the current environment to understand whether it is viable. And also really challenging, what is it that guests really need and want? So and from that, actually, what of that provision could perhaps be stopped in order to make the operation more efficient? And also then, if you are looking at outsourcing, then really take time to understand those issues that are specific to the hotel market, and really take care that the outsourced provider is able to adapt and deal with those, and perhaps it has experience of doing so. So thank you very much. Hopefully that's given everybody a bit of a scene setter as we take the discussion forward. And I'll just hand back to you now, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Graeme. A couple of questions that have come through. Firstly, the data you've been using, is that London, particularly focused on London, or is that international trends as well, you're saying?
I think it's particularly London, but we do see it across other gateway cities as well across Europe. Absolutely, and also comes from speaking to our teams over in the US, and of course, often what we see in the US market tends to come over to the UK and Europe in the end.
Yeah, and there's been a question about pricing on low alcohol and non-alcoholic drinks. Any thoughts on that?
So, and this is a good point. I think there has been some increased focus on what are the prices that guests are being charged for, I think, classical soft drinks, where I think people were seeing that they weren't particularly offering very good value and significant markups on those. But I think what we are seeing in those drinks which are specifically designed to be low or no alcohol, whether it's in the cocktails, whether it's through to beer and wine, actually the pricing on those, customers do seem happy to pay similar prices for that as they will for alcoholic drinks, on the basis that they know that it's been designed specifically for that purpose, and actually that, you know, the taste of them is really good now. So I think for those very specific drinks, people are comfortable paying similar prices. I think on the very basic soft drinks, you know, operators do need to be careful not to be seen to be overcharging for those.
And the final question is that you seem to, listening to what you're saying, you seem to believe obviously F&B is actually quite important for the overall marketing of the hotel as well. So you assume your stance is the value driver.
Well, so I think it's important to understand the role that F&B does play in the hotel itself. I think for what we have seen in more of the limited service, the value end of the hotel market, then the ability to actually strip out F&B provision and take that cost out of the hotel operation means that then the hotelier can offer a keener price to the customer for the room stay. I think, yeah, that's one element of it, but I do think where it is something that's valued and wanted by the consumer, then really being able to create those kind of statement spaces, statement areas that are shareable actually can help the hotel itself even promote itself without them having to, you know, to do that themselves. The customers become their own marketing tool, which is quite impressive when that happens.
Very fair. Thank you very much, Graeme. That was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Can I now introduce Karen Friebe and James Fowler from Bird & Bird, who I think are going to come in talking about outsourcing. Karen and James, can you join us? Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I think we're just waiting for James.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Friebe. I head up the hotels and hospitality team at international law firm Bird & Bird, and I'm going to be presenting to you today, together with my colleague James Fowler, who's a senior associate at our firm, on outsourcing, the various models that we've seen employed, the structures, options, and practical pitfalls. James and I have worked together on numerous hotel management agreement and franchise deals over the years, and that includes a number of different types of outsourcing arrangements. So we're hoping to share a snapshot of our experience with you today. Thank you. So just as a bit of scene setting, historically, food and beverage operations in hotels could tend towards the bland and the drab. But in recent years, F&B has been the subject of renewed focus from hoteliers, as Graeme was saying. As more and more consumers consider themselves foodies, perhaps, and consider cuisine to be an integral part of any trip or hotel stay. So hoteliers are responding, and they want to ensure that their F&B operations enhance rather than detract from the guest experience, and also, where possible, act as a draw for non-hotel customers. So is the brightly lit hotel restaurant a thing of the past? There's also sound financial sense in improving F&B performance, with F&B revenue contributing between 20 to 40% of total hotel revenue, according to the stats. So it makes sense to get the F&B right in your hotel and to find ways to drive profitability from that revenue. However, some hoteliers have come to realise that F&B in hotels is not really where their third-party managers' strength lies, and they've looked at outsourcing the F&B operations as a means of buying in the requisite expertise. And that's often, as you'll have seen, to well-known chefs or restaurant brands. And with this in mind, owners are increasingly carving out the F&B operations from the scope, for example, of their hotel management agreements, or at least they're reserving the right to do so in the future with consequential amendments needing to be made to their hotel management agreements. And that's something that we're increasingly seeing with a regular management agreement. You'll have the ability built in, particularly with the larger hotels, for the owner to remove the F&B operations, or perhaps just some of them if there are several at some time in the future. So I'd like to now look at some of the structures, 3 of the structures that a hotel owner can use if it wants to outsource its F&B operations. And then I'll pass over to James to look at some of the challenges that this brings, particularly where the owner has an incumbent hotel manager in place under a hotel management agreement. So we typically see the following structures used when an owner wants to appoint a specialist F&B operator. The first of these is the lease model. Here the owner would carve out the F&B facilities, for example, the restaurant and usually also the kitchen areas of the hotel. It would also carve out responsibility for the operation of the F&B offering itself from the scope of, say, the hotel management agreement, and grant a lease of the F&B facilities themselves to the food and beverage operator. Under this model, the food and beverage operator would pay a rent, which is either fixed or turnover based, but we often see combinations of the two. And that rent would obviously be paid to the owner. And you would see a number of the normal lease provisions that you'd expect to see, but obviously tailored to the operation of the restaurant. There are a number of provisions that are quite bespoke to these particular structures. So often you'll see requirements for the tenant to refresh all the fittings, regular intervals, tables and chairs. You know, for example, I think 7 years is probably the regular interval that you'd expect to see, at which an owner would expect a total refresh of the fixtures and fittings within the restaurant. But that's just one example of some of the typical provisions that you might see. Moving on to the second potential model, a food and beverage management agreement. Here again, the owner would carve out the food and beverage facilities, the restaurant and the kitchen areas of the hotel, and would carve out responsibility for the operation of the food and beverage offering from the scope of the hotel management agreement. These would then be reallocated to the food and beverage operator under a specific food and beverage management agreement. Under this model, as with a normal hotel management agreement, the food and beverage operator would be paid management fees, commonly a base and incentive fee, with the remaining profit belonging to the owner. And the third structure that I wanted to mention is the consultancy arrangement, under which the primary responsibility for the operation of the food and beverage would remain with the owner or with the manager if there's a hotel management agreement in place. The owner then appoints the food and beverage operator in a consultative role to provide high-level strategic advice and support, for example, with menu setting, provisioning, training, and budgeting. And that support would be provided to the owner, or if there's a hotel management agreement, it would be provided to the manager. Under this model, the food and beverage operator would be paid consultancy fees, and if there's a hotel management agreement, those would commonly be treated as operating expenses. So those are the basic structures. There are a number of challenges that we have seen. The one that springs to my mind, and which James will touch on in more detail, is the hierarchy that comes into play with one of these structures, and how you manage that so that you don't have discord, but you have agreement and a holistic treatment of the F&B facilities within the overall context of the hotel operation. So I'm going to pass over to James now, who will address some of those challenges.
Thank you very much, Karen, and good morning, everyone. It's very good to be with you. So I think it's fair to say that outsourcing F&B operations, in our experience, works best or has the best chance of success when the operator's been carefully selected, there's been good stakeholder management in that appointment, and when there's a good working relationship. But whilst everyone theoretically is invested in the same outcome, a successful outcome, challenges do arise. And this is particularly the case when there's an incumbent manager in place. But with some careful consideration, these can be solved and these can be mitigated. So in this section, we're going to take a quick look at some of the common challenges that parties to an F&B outsourcing arrangement will have to resolve in order to give themselves the best chance of a successful outcome. The first of those, as Karen mentioned, is reporting and the chain of command. So if the owner has an incumbent manager in place, then there's going to be a decision as to whether and to what extent there needs to be a hierarchy between the incumbent hotel manager and the specialist F&B operator. And there's two options that the owner can take here. The question owner has to ask itself is, option one, are the hotel manager and the F&B operator separately responsible to the owner for their respective fiefdoms? Ostensibly, this might seem like quite a neat delineation of responsibility, and it might ruffle the fewest feathers at the outset. But in reality, it doesn't really necessarily foster cooperation, and it makes the owner the middleman and the arbiter of any potential dispute between those two managers. Alternatively, the outsourced F&B operation could be treated as just a component of the overall hotel operation, and therefore the F&B operator would be answerable to the manager, and in particular to the appointed general manager. The problem, of course, with that approach is that although it creates a clearer and a neater reporting structure, and from the owner's perspective, they have a single point of authority and responsibility and contact in the hotel operation, if you're appointing an F&B operator to manage the F&B, they're the specialist that you brought in, they may very well object to the idea that they're answerable to the hotel manager, who's not necessarily the specialist, and that they won't have the final say over F&B operations. The second challenge that we wanted to look at, and it's something that Graeme touched on in his presentation, is provision of food to hotel guests. So the F&B operator might view the restaurant and the public-facing part of the F&B offering as a standalone outlet. And indeed, the owner might, of course, be keen to use the F&B operation in order to attract non-hotel customers. But you can't forget about the guests of the hotel. And the owner may well expect the outsourced F&B operator to provide breakfast to the guests of the hotel and to provide room service to the guests of the hotel. And that will usually be backed up by a service level agreement between the owner and the F&B operator. So the F&B operator will potentially need to be prepared to provide these services to hotel guests, and to do so with the same level of care that it gives the rest of its offering. This also raises questions about cost allocation and pricing, which again, Graeme touched on. So he mentioned that if hotels offer breakfast as part of the room rate, then the specialist F&B operator will want to make sure that there's a mechanism for allocating a pro rata amount of that room rate to the F&B operation. And in terms of pricing, the owner will want to make sure that the cost that the F&B operator charges for room service, for example, isn't disproportionate to the price point of the hotel rooms and the other services that are provided by the hotel. The third challenge that we wanted to look at is the question of liability. And again, this is a particularly difficult topic when there is both an incumbent hotel manager and a specialist F&B operator who have to share the same space. They will each want to make sure that the other is held accountable for their own acts and that they won't be blamed for any shortcomings or mistakes committed by the other party. The owner will also want to make sure that if something goes wrong between the hotel and the F&B operation, it knows who it needs to point the finger at. But it's not always as simple as drawing a line between the lobby and the guest rooms and the restaurant and the kitchen. and allocating liability accordingly. To use an imagined but hopefully practical example, say for example, a mouse is found running around the hotel reception. Well, that might ostensibly seem like it's the hotel manager's fault, but they won't want to be held in breach of their hotel management agreement if in fact the mouse came from the kitchen where the F&B operator had left food on the floor. Conversely, imagine a situation where a mouse is found running around the kitchen, which you might ostensibly think is the F&B operator's fault. Well, the F&B operator won't want to be liable if the mouse actually came up from the basement of the hotel because the hotel manager had failed to lay adequate rodent traps. From the owner's perspective, they don't want the operator and the hotel manager to be pointing fingers at each other without the problem being solved. So the agreements between all three parties will need to draw a very clear line for responsibility and allocate liability accordingly. The fourth challenge that we wanted to look at, we've titled reputational matters. So the owner's agreement with the F&B operator will naturally contain quality control provisions relating to the F&B offering. So those will normally contain service level requirements relating to food, service, presentational requirements, and so on, to ensure that there's a consistency of quality between the F&B offering and the hotel. If the F&B operator is a celebrity chef or a restaurant brand, and that's commonly the type of third-party experts brought in, then the management and conduct of that specialist's wider business may have an impact on the reputation of the hotel itself. So one of the challenges that arises is, what if the F&B operator wants to fundamentally change its branding, its pricing, or its offering? Well, the owner and the hotel manager will want to make sure that any changes to the branding of the offering remain consistent with the standards and the positioning of the hotel itself. Obviously, a luxury hotel wouldn't want its restaurant to suddenly become a fast food outlet. But conversely, the F&B operator won't want the metaphorical tail to wag the dog and be hindered by the hotel's requirements in a way which might fetter their wider business and branding decisions. And the final challenge that we wanted to touch on is data. So data is a key asset to many businesses, and the owner, the manager, and the F&B operator will inevitably vie over the right to collect, receive, and use data of the guests of the hotel's F&B facilities. And this creates some quite interesting questions. So, for example, should the owner and the manager have the right to cross-market to the F&B operator's customer database, and vice versa, should the F&B operator be allowed to market to hotel guests? Another question is whether a walk-in guest at the hotel restaurant is a guest of the hotel and therefore a customer of the owner or the manager, or a guest specifically of the F&B offering, in which case they'd be a customer of the F&B operator. Whatever practical arrangement the parties come to, it's of course paramount that the requisite consents are obtained and that all of the data is gathered and processed in accordance with applicable data protection laws. So just to sum up, engaging an F&B operator to run a hotel's F&B operations offers clear benefits and opportunities to all of the parties that are involved, but establishing and agreeing the various rights and responsibilities that underpin that arrangement can be very complex, and it's important to think about and cater for all of these potential pitfalls and challenges in advance, so that when you start out on your journey, you are giving yourself the best chance of success. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. And Karen, there's just a couple of quick questions that come from the panel, from the audience. I mean, firstly, who pays for the capex in a management agreement and for the fit out? James, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry. So I think in our experience, in a F&B management agreement, the fit out and the capex would be treated in much the same way as it would be under a normal hotel management agreement. So I think we would typically expect the owner to fund the capital expenditure, but with budgeting processes and adherence to brand standards being the governing principles.
Great, thank you, James. And final question, really, for both of you. If someone's asking, can you give a little bit more meat on the bone regarding the kind of percentages, the kind of percentages that are normally charged between an outsourced partner in terms of rent and the operator, the hotel owner? So what kind of concession would be paid, or would it be a ground rent, and what happens to fixed costs?
So I'm having difficulty putting my video on at the moment. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah,
I think it's quite difficult to get into granular detail in this forum about that. I think they're all quite bespoke arrangements, and we've seen a real variety in terms of percentages. But you would frequently, with a lease, say, have a base rent and a turnover rent. That's a very common model that we would see in a lease.
Right. All right. Thank you. Well, thank you both very much indeed, and well done in your presentation. It's very good.
Thank you.
I now have the pleasure of inviting onto screen Russell Kett, Chairman of HVS, who's going to host the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Good morning, everybody. And first, if I can invite my panelists to unmute themselves and put themselves on screen. Really appreciated the presentation.
We can't turn the on-screen thing. You're controlling it.
We're going to be joined, I think, by David as well. Thank you. So we've got David Michels, Pablo Pimienta, the founder of Riviera Real Estate, Laura Brinkman, the Senior Vice President of KSL Capital, and Andrew Stembridge, the Executive Director of Iconic Luxury Hotels. Between them, they cover the depth and breadth of the world of hotel food and beverage. And as I'm sure you will all come to learn, each one has some very useful opinions about the sector. Now, I've prepared a number of questions to kick off our session, but I'm very, very keen to include as many questions from those who are joining us online as possible. So please use the Q&A function, register your question, and then if you can, make sure that you've disclosed your name and your company so that we know who you are. Your questions matter far more than mine. Now, when we spoke as a panel some weeks ago, it became clear that there are different types of hotel F&B. David very kindly, broadly classifies them as either roundabout hotels, so which breakfast and possibly little more are what the guest really requires, and the Savoy type, where a large variety of different F&B experiences are needed, the whole 9 yards, ranging from room service to fine dining, from bar lounges to banqueting. So as long as we've got people on this webinar whose interests cover any point on this broad spectrum, then we're concerned to ensure that whatever your F&B operations are, that they're as profitable as they can be. However, sometimes we won't have too much choice or opportunity to improve because we're providing the facilities and services that our guests require, and sometimes there isn't really much money to be made, or is there? And on the subject of definitions, for this purpose, let's refer to profit as departmental profit, which means the profit before deductions of overheads such as rent, rates, energy costs, property costs and maintenance, marketing and so forth. So theoretically, to break even, your F&B departmental profit needs to be at least 15% of F&B revenue, and conceivably more than 20%, which is what you would need to achieve if you were an independent hotel and an independent restaurant comparing with your hotel F&B profitability. So I'm told that at the AHC conference in October, HotStats confirmed that UK F&B profit conversion had dropped from 32.7% of revenue in July 2018 to 21.8% now. And for London, this showed a drop from 29.7% to 17%. So clearly the trend in F&B profitability is heading south. Is it too much to hope that our experts today can help you all to turn this around? Let's start with a short, big picture question. What is there to prevent any hotel from making some level of profit out of its F&B operations, whatever the type of hotel they are or whatever they have to be doing to satisfy their customers' requirements? Andrew, why don't you kick us off with that?
In our case, we make profit in all our hotels. We've got a diverse range of properties and they all make profit. It varies, but there's no reason why they shouldn't, as long as you understand F&B and as long as you understand where it can go wrong and where you might lose money.
Laura, your thoughts?
To me, so I concur with what Andrew's saying. Luckily, we have managed to continue to maintain profitability across our assets, but what's keeping operators from staying profitable is losing sight of detailed analytics in the F&B operation, cost creeping, not managing that effectively, or potentially, we've had some tough times, and some hotel and F&B or F&B alone operators really needed to pivot, change the offering, adjust to the consumer behaviors that have just been touched on. And so to me, if that's not happening, then that's preventing people from turning a profit.
David, what trends have you noticed in the last few years?
Negative.
Going south.
More competition, more. I had lunch yesterday with a very famous restaurateur, it's a true story, it'll be quick, who runs 4 or 5 very successful full restaurants in London, charges £18.75 for scrambled eggs, which is a speciality, can't get any more customers in and isn't making a profit. Rates, rents, cost of food, labour, where do you go from there? I don't think that's typical, and I'm sure it'll change. But if a pure restaurateur in the best high streets in London can't make a profit, hotels, in my opinion, unpopularly so for this session, shouldn't try to make a profit, but should try and reduce the loss as much as possible to facilitate the main reason for being in business, which is to satisfy guests and fill rooms and fill conference halls and so on, if it's that kind of hotel. It's all a difference of approach. Either I'm desperate to make a restaurant profit and I'll sacrifice money to do so, or I'll realize it's a cost the same as having beds, TVs and staff, and I'll satisfy the customer enough and reduce the costs accordingly. And that's after 60 years of failure as a restaurateur, complete failure across thousands of hotels, I've come to that conclusion.
Never an honest man, or never a more honest man than you, David. Thank you. Pablo, to what extent might you link improvements in the hotel's average room rate or occupancy with the performance achieved in its F&B, to sort of take on David's theme of, you are what you are, you're there to serve guests. How could you use your F&B operations to perhaps drive more into the average room rate or get more bums in beds?
Well, I think what David was alluding to with his sad experience is that the margin levels for restaurants are notoriously lower than what can be achieved from beds. So I think what can, first of all, prevent the F&B from being profitable is a low footfall. And when I used to work for Cadogan Estate, we had a number of hotels in central London, in Chelsea, and these are places where people have the option to eat out elsewhere. So when we were choosing operators, especially as the capex were going to be high and they were going to be a high fixed costs, we were seeking hotel operators that had a famous restaurant brand with a degree of awareness, guarantee a certain level of footfall. For example, people like Belmont, the Beaverbrook, or more recently Hotel Cost on Sloane Square. They're all names that have got a track record in food, and we were hoping that a attracting them would guarantee footfall from externals. Whether whether growth in food in the hotel can have an impact on the actual hotel profitability, I mean, it's quite hard to prove. I expect, there will be examples, for example, country house hotels that probably Laura is a better place to speak about, or destination restaurants in the middle of nowhere, where actually restaurant bookings will grow the hotel revenue. But it also depends, I suppose, on the definition we take for F&B. If we include things like banqueting, meeting, conferencing, people booking weddings could have an impact on the room rate.
Okay, thank you. We've mentioned costs and operating costs already quite a few times. So given the increase in operating costs, whether it's staffing costs, energy costs, and so forth, what is your advice, panel, to our audience today as to how they should really go about tackling this issue and reverse any decline in profitability that their F&B operations might have experienced? Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, for us, Pablo, you mentioned it briefly, and David, yeah, I don't operate, we don't operate hotels in central London right now, so I can't speak towards that. But to take one example,
all right. Many of our audience members are also from outside London, and some are even from abroad.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, we operate restaurants across the continent and the UK regions, and we're, as well as Asia and various other places, as you know. But to take one example where we have spent enormous time, because for the big hotels, F&B makes up a larger portion than rooms of total revenue produced. It is the bread and butter of this business. So we've done an analytics deep dive, which I touched on very briefly earlier, to look at revenue evolution, throughout the COVID years, the post-COVID recovery. We've looked at our cost evolution, labor cost, utilities, etc. And I do echo David by saying that we've seen costs, go up disproportionately across the board. But at the same time, I was so very impressed with, our management team that has created transparency across the 8 operating assets that we have right now. Competition amongst the head chefs to share best practices as it relates to budgeting, as it relates to menu engineering, as it relates to staff rotas. And so we were able to identify, quite a lot of wins and this is coming from a business that has 12 years of incredible success of operating restaurants every day of the week, every time of the day. So I do think that it's not impossible to navigate these environments, but it does require a lot of work. It does require a lot of scrutiny and then discipline, which takes time sometimes to instill.
David, work, discipline, scrutiny.
I mean,
any other advice?
The restaurant business, like the hotel business, if there's a magic spell, please tell us somebody, and we can shut the session down. If there's no magic spell, it's an industry of detail. It's hundreds and hundreds of small details: size of portions, the product you buy, the labor you employ, the kitchen you skill or de-skill, when you leave the facilities open, when you don't leave the facilities open, do you actually offer the offer you're thinking about in the first place? Because the answer always is, let's have more footfall. You can't in most hotels, in most places. I can if I'm in Grosvenor Square. I can't, I'm in the middle of the Yorkshire Moors, right? Okay. Generally. So all you can do is internal things, but the danger of doing it extremely well is that you just might put off the customer, because while they don't need good food in what you called a roundabout hotel, they still don't want bad food. So a bad food experience can turn your room customer away. Finding that balance is a mixture of mixing 20 or 30 different things, and they're very hard to get right, because you'll always bend slightly one way or too much the other. But it's a mixture of experience, flexibility, and trial to combat the increased costs and certainly not an increased food footfall. I mean, not only do we suffer from a decreased food footfall, but many hotels are suffering from less conference and banqueting, which is very much part of food, as I think Pablo said. A big income, very, very many less conferences today, less corporate events. I guess there's the same number of weddings and bar mitzvahs, but there's definitely a shortfall across this country, and I think the continent, of that great mainstay of conferences. They're coming back a bit, but I don't think they'll ever come back to what they were. So you're not only sitting often with slightly empty restaurants, instead of filling your conference rooms 40% a year, which I think was typical pre-COVID, anyone can correct me, I believe we're talking about 30% a year, big difference.
Pablo, from your perspective?
I mean, I've only ever worked for owners, not operators, so I don't have a terrible experience of cost management, but what is being done across the board in the F&B sector, standalone F&B, is the same tricks that people are looking at. It's changing the hours of operation, having more flexible staff, changing the menus. I mean, I see in a number of hotels actually sometimes, hotels refocusing on a bit on less items, but doing them a bit better. So things like the best burger in town or tapas, fixed lunch menus for businesses. And then something that a number of restaurants in key cities are doing is focusing more on beverage, which has higher margins. There's an advantage to hotels, I found in my experience, is usually the ability to get a much later alcohol license.
Okay.
So that could be something to play with.
All right, you mentioned hours. Everybody's talking about detail. Andrew, have you got a different message, or is it very much violent agreement with the others?
I think it's the same, but there are lots of things you can do, and it's using sort of moving with the time. So, one of the things that I think a lot of the restaurant operators are doing well is working with dark kitchens. So they're actually buying in. They can improve their end product by buying in a lot of sauces, et cetera, which take a lot of time and skill to make. And by doing that, and I think it's taking. I think hotels F&B can learn a lot from a lot of the experienced restaurant operators who are actually generally way ahead of hotels. So it's nailing down, it's controlling the controllable, and I think as sort of Laura alluding to, it's matching the passion of a really vibrant restaurant experience with control and processes, and making sure that everything is, as much as it can be, is locked down. And which again is something we're generally not very good at. And as David alluded to, I think the hotel focus tends to be on the room side of it, because that's where the money can be made, and that sometimes is at the expense of the F&B side. So certainly, in our experience, we're looking at dark kitchens. We're looking at trying to consolidate suppliers as much as possible. We're trying to reduce the number of line items. And it's something that's work in progress. I mean, like you everyone's alluded to, we've seen a drop in our F&B profitability, but it is still strong. But we can't afford to let that diminish any further. We need to reverse. And as an exercise, we have on Procure Wizard, we have 5,000 food product items that we buy across all our hotels, and that's only 6 hotels in the UK. So that's 5,000 items. So that alone just shows you what the opportunity is in terms of reducing that. So I think it's that analytical drill down that Laura mentioned. It's using technology, which is actually very affordable for F&B. So I think there are, with the right focus, there's a lot of things that can be done to make sure you optimize the profitability.
So I had a quick scroll through our audience while the 2 presentations were going on before. And I think it's fair to say that there are some people on this call whose F&B operations can best be described as bland or uninspiring. They probably don't have much in the way of capital to be able to spend. So what could they do with minimal capex in order to improve their business? Not much to spend, but what can they do to improve their business, to make their F&B operations less bland, less uninspiring? David, do you want to kick us off on that?
I mean, it's a bit of a general question, right? If I had spare capex today, assuming my restaurants were not atrocious, I wouldn't spend it in the restaurant. I wouldn't spend it in the one area where most of my guests don't want to eat. I would spend it in other parts of the hotel and make the guest experience more exciting, whether that's a big atelier, more comfortable bed, more welcoming staff. I wouldn't spend it in the F&B area. I'll give you one quick true example, right? A London hotel, can't mention the name, we advise, had a 400 rooms around the Grosvenor Square area, had a big chef in. It didn't work, mostly because of COVID. They now have, the owner desperately wanted a great chef to help the name of the hotel. They just ran their own fairly mediocre restaurant, and for the last 6 months, the hotel's run 90% at 800 quid. And people are still trying to tell me that people come to hotels because of great chefs. They might on occasion, right? And the other thing we need to remember is that when great chefs come in and outside operators, it's the hotelier that bears the capex. It must be £1 million to do up a restaurant if you include the kitchen. And believe me, the hotel kitchen's never good enough for the great chefs. So you're putting in £1 million to have a chef into your hotel. Personally, I'd take that £1 million, find a decent high street and own my own restaurant.
Okay, Pablo, going back to the original question, keeping the expenditure a fraction of David's £1 million, what can we do to really make a significant change in a mediocre restaurant that nobody, of course, on our call is going to own up to having, but let's say that they did?
It's a difficult question. I would come back to what I said. I think I would focus on perhaps on getting the basic right, a smaller menu, a couple of items very well done. There's other tricks, and I accept it doesn't apply to a number of people on this call, but the very clever people at Soho House who have got very wet-led type of operations, what they've done over the years to increase profitability is they've pre-made a number of their cocktails in bottles that are still equally successful to the customer. I mean, it's a difficult question. The one thing I would say about David's comment on the chefs is I tend to agree, but what I'm seeing is perhaps generally in the F&B space a slight move away from Michelin star chef towards instead more concepts. I'll explain. Previously, the old model was you get a Michelin star chef. It's very high capex, high cost, but it has a high marketing value. And I think those days are slightly shifting towards restaurants that do not rely on a chef, but instead on an ambiance. So the customers now, which requirements are changing, they will want a lot more concepts. So I'm thinking about, again, this is a luxury sector. People like Koya, people like the Paper Moon restaurant that came from Milan into the new Raffles Hotel, or indeed, people have done it very well for years. The Hoxtons of this world, the Mama Shelter, all the sort of lifestyle brands, or the Standard Hotel before them. I think these people never really relied on chefs and actually got footfall through working on the concept. So that's probably what I would do.
Pablo, we're moving off the subject. I'm going to bring us back and ask Andrew to just focus on the more bland part of the sector and what can those restaurants do to improve themselves.
I think for me, it's creating a vibe, and that doesn't cost. That doesn't actually cost very much, or if anything, to create a vibe. And I think if you use some of the best pubs as an example of that, they can be really quite grim, the decor, but actually if they're warm and inviting and cozy and the music's right and the lighting's right, and I think that whole early in my career I used to work for Ken McCulloch, who you know, fantastic operator from a theatrical perspective. And I just, it's that whole lights, camera, action, that whole side of it in terms of, you know, and our whole thing was, as the evening went on, the lights got darker, the music got louder, and you create a situation. And I was involved in the opening of the first Mile Maisons on the F&B side, and I think it doesn't cost much to turn the lights down, turn the music up, get some candles in. And I think actually, as sort of Pablo alluded to, that it's doing some simple things really well. You know, even across, we've got some fantastic restaurants. Our single biggest selling item is still a burger, but we charge 25 quid for a burger because you can, but it needs to be a bloody good burger. So I think it's focusing on things that people do what people want. And I think for anyone, it's looking around them and saying, right, if you know, people don't eat in their own restaurants enough. I think if you eat in your own restaurant and be really critical about how bad it really is and be honest with yourself, go to all the restaurants around you that are full when you're not and saying, right, why are they full? What have they got on their menus? And, you know, we've got this saying, which is not copy ideas, but borrow with pride. And you actually just understand what other people, and if you can't afford to bring in a consultant or spend the capex, just look at who's actually doing it really, really well. And just take a bunch of those ideas and put them on your menu. But if you look at their most successful restaurants, then their menus are all very, very similar, even in the heart of London. You know, and I think you could do worse than just to pick those key sort of crowd pleasers that people like. Turn the lights down, turn the music up, get some candles in, and actually, I'm sure you'll be more successful than you were the day before.
Is it just a question of turning the lights down then, Laura?
Well, as Andrew was describing this, I was thinking about a very generously sized 180 cover Holiday Inn restaurant or Marriott restaurant that is a little bit difficult to, you know, that is naked and stale, which hasn't been capexed or renovated in over 10 years. So no, I don't think so. I think it's a real challenge for certain restaurants that were designed with a view towards catering to good volume, and they might have the volume, you know, for breakfast, so they can't do without. But then because of brand standards, have to comply with all day operating hours or lunch and dinner service. Like if you find yourself in that situation, then that is just tough. And I don't think, and then if you have minimal capex, I'm with David a little bit. Like I struggle. Why would you waste your little capex on that space where you know that you're not going to yield a material outcome or an ROI on it? I take a view, but this is from a perspective of ownership and control, and the ability to largely influence what we do with our spaces. And obviously, every pound and dollar and euro that we try to invest, we have an expectation to put that to work. You know, sometimes it's good to know what you don't know. And so if you have such limitations, you find yourself in this situation, then maybe it's just you know, it's a point of self-reflection and saying, look, this isn't what we should be doing. And so it's a matter of then cutting your losses. I think somebody said that earlier. Approaching the brand if you find yourself in the situation and saying, look, this just isn't working. It's not working for the owner, it's not working for our guests, and it's not working for the brand either. Okay. I'm going to ask for some very short answers to a number of questions. I've just been looking at the questions that have come in from our distinguished audience, and there are a couple there that I want to touch on. But just as you were mentioning brand standards, Laura, I was prompted to think of a question which says, what advice do each of you have for the major international hotel operators, whether it's Marriott, Hilton, IHG, Hyatt, whoever, to change their brand standards for food and beverage to something that's going to be more appropriate in the current environment? So just one each, one piece of advice, one
change to brand standards that you would suggest that they apply to their F&B requirements? David, you want to kick us off with that?
I mean, as probably the leader of once the biggest brand in the world, you don't have to do everything the brands tell you. You just don't, right? The lawyers who were on this before will tell you, you can get away with not doing as long as there's a commercial, sensible reason behind it. Some of the things they said, no one does 100%. If your restaurant is your worst area, and it may not be and need not be, then don't argue, just simply ignore the brand standards in that area and they won't close you down. I'm being awfully practical and I'm gamekeeper turned poacher, but it's still true.
Okay. Pablo?
I was going to say something similar. I think a number of
and
these
if it's only similar, don't say it. We'll move on.
Quickly, a number of these big groups are doing a lot more with the lifestyle brands that have a more flexible brand standards. So I would take a page from that book for the other more corporate operations.
Okay, Andrew?
I actually think they're getting better already. I think they've moved on. But I think the only thing, I think this sort of local, allowing a local focus, I think is definitely a game changer, because that opens up to that sort of that local audience as well.
Okay, Laura?
Yeah, summarizing what they some of the things they've said is, if you are a sophisticated owner and you know how to design a concept and understand what your market is, then you can, to David's point, can yield a much better outcome. Whereas if you're an unsophisticated owner and you get that 3,000-page PIP and you're delivering against those brand standards, then you find yourself with empty 200-seat restaurants that, you know, have 80% coverage for breakfast and the rest is nothing. So to me, it's really between that. Like, if the brands want to add value and you're not dealing with a sophisticated owner who comes to you and says, this is what makes sense for my property, this is what I'm going to build, you know, you're welcome to join on board or not, like we have equal leverage, then I think that's where the brands can absolutely be smarter and share some of these learnings. They run feasibility studies, they have F&B experts, they have CapEx experts, architects, etc. on hand. So that to me is it.
Okay. Turning to our audience, some, again, quick responses, thoughts on how to achieve flexible labor, scaling up and down in the conference and banqueting space in a challenging recruitment environment. Anyone want to take on a quick answer to that? How to achieve more flexible labor, scaling up or down in our conference and banqueting space? And it's a challenge to recruit.
I think, I mean, labor is our biggest issue every day of the week. I think the way to be flexible is actually understand what each individual member of staff, what suits their lifestyle. And I think you'd be quite surprised when you actually, if you get into that granular detail with the individuals, of understanding when works with them, they're actually probably more interested in being more flexible than you actually think they are.
Okay. A rather basic question from our questioner, who says long stay hotels that don't have F&B as a serious part of the offering should take advantage of F&B. I think the question is, how can hotels that don't have F&B as a serious part of their offering take advantage of their F&B space? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'd say if you want to commit suicide, then do it.
Yeah.
As the song says, suicide is painless. Laura, what did you want to offer?
I disagree with the hypotheses. Your long stay customer has a totally different need profile. And, you know, unless you have a home-like kitchen where you're rotating the menu like your mother would or your wife would, or sorry, this is totally stereotypical. I don't see how your long stay customer is your number one customer that will fill the restaurant. I agree. It would be suicide to design a restaurant or F&B for that type of customer.
Okay.
And vice versa, I would put long stay into neighborhoods where you have F&B offering that offers diversity.
Okay. So in the case of mediocre performance by the F&B segment and the hotel doesn't have or want to incur any CapEx, the question is whether providing flexibility to customers with an online delivery to their hotel rooms, could this be a viable option to maximize customers' value and also simultaneously cutting the so much worry that they have about the F&B spending?
When you see McDonald's wrappers in the Savoy and the Ritz and the Waldorf Astoria, you know that the customer's wise enough to call and make their own deliveries. The customers are always wiser than we are. It's trying to understand what they know that's so they're difficult.
I remember 35 years ago, a hotel I was asset managing near Heathrow Airport. The customer dialed from their hotel bedroom in the days when people made calls from their hotel. They called an outside number that rang in the kitchen, that they then ordered a pizza that was put in a box and then delivered by room service to their room. And that hotel made a superb amount of money by selling the pizza, not only, but also from the phone call that they charged to the guest account. Moving on. Anybody else want to come in on that particular point about Uber and Deliveroo and whatever?
Yeah, why would you want to be a middleman? No one wants you to be a middleman, and everyone has if that's what the guest chooses, which is like access to local deliveries, then they are more than capable to do it themselves. I think what our industry can do better is shaming guests into, or forbidding guests to take the odd meal up to their room, because I feel like that's not in line with the times anymore.
Okay, another question from our audience. Would you see a food hall as a value driver for a hotel?
If you're based in an airport.
Okay. In terms of operations, would you outsource the entire management or work with a restaurant cluster? Each location has its own outsourcing setup. Andrew?
I mean, one of the things I jotted down earlier in terms of sort of cost saving is consolidation of kitchens. You know, that's the one thing in hotels where each kitchen costs a lot to run. If you can consolidate kitchens and staffing and servicing them, then it saves a lot of money. Obviously, the more you segment the offer, then it makes it harder for anyone to make money. But then there are lots of examples where that does work. But certainly, it would go against my advice. But if each individual operator can make money and the hotel can the owner can make money from it, then that's fine. But I think for me, the more you segment it, the more it becomes a challenge to turn a profit.
Earlier on in Graeme's presentation, he talked about alcohol-free stuff. One of our audiences said, on a similar theme to the alcohol question, what about the trend towards more meat-free eating? Is that having an impact on our restaurants, on our food and beverage operations? Pablo, you are nodding vigorously.
Yeah, I'm seeing that in the restaurant space. It's not that hard to tackle, though. I think any good restaurant now will have a vegan option, a gluten-free option. And if we haven't seen that in most hotels, I think it will be the case in a couple of years from now.
I mean, for the last 50 years, most restaurants have had a vegan option. Nothing's changed. There's just more fuss about it.
And you are nodding vigorously, Laura.
Yeah, I concur. We've seen more of, and maybe David's right. It's been labeled more clearly and it's being advertised, but it certainly helps the menu because in many cases the vegetarian options have higher margins than, for instance, the fillet or the lobster.
Sure.
I think the difference is now, Russell, that I mean, we've tried at one point, I suppose, when it first became more fashionable, we tried insisting on 20% of our menus being plant-based. And it's amazing how in different locations that just doesn't work. There just isn't demand for it. And I think it is definitely there's more demand in the sort of cosmopolitan areas without question. But I think the main thing that's changed is that people behave in different ways. There's a lot of people who will only eat meat once or twice a week now. So they're not vegetarian or vegan. They just actually enjoy the choice. So I think it's giving people choice. And I think that what a lot of good chefs like Ottolenghi, etc., have established, that it doesn't, it's not an inferior choice. It's often a superior choice in terms of the actual dishes themselves. And I say there's a lot of great chefs who are really doing some fantastic things. And actually, to be honest, you'd be hard pushed to miss, if you're a meat lover, you'd be hard pushed to miss the meat in it.
Okay.
It's a funny world, Russell. We used to go into a restaurant and they used to say, hello, welcome to the establishment. Would you like a drink? It's sunny outside. How's your mother? And now the only thing they ask you, the first thing they ask you is, have you got any allergies?
Okay, question that isn't for David or for me. First of all, what is a cloud kitchen?
A cloud kitchen? Is that like did you mean the dark kitchen that I referred to, or?
Well, I've got a question that says, can a hotel take advantage of cloud kitchens? And if we don't know what a cloud kitchen is, I'm assuming David doesn't. I certainly don't. But if
Maybe
we
centralized,
I'm sorry?
maybe off-site centralized, but
Maybe.
what we refer to as what we understand to be the dark
Maybe.
kitchen.
Maybe. But does
Might
any of
be,
you...
might be a central kitchen. Remember the old days in London and Graeme met? We used to cook all the food in one place and send it out to the hotels.
We
I'm
did it at the
guessing
Cumberland as well. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe there is a case where you've got the scale to be able to do that. I'm very conscious that we're getting close to time. So a very quick answer. Every panel should include something on ESG, in my humble opinion. We're getting to the stage where it isn't just an optional extra. So how much do you and your organization think about ESG and the environment aspects within operations in F&B, whether it's sourcing locally, we've talked about that, reducing emissions, haven't talked about that, controlling the quality of product, modernizing kitchens, moving away from gas and the premium associated with it. So are you already factoring this into CapEx budgets in the future? And is this starting to impact profitability in your operations? Very quick answer from you, Laura, first, and then we'll just go round.
Yeah, all of the things you mentioned were I suggested up front because they are all the initiatives that are happening and have happened since the inception of the PIG hotels. And Soneva, our investment in Asia, for instance, these two are really our global leaders on how to be sustainable in every single step of their decision making. And to give one brief example, Soneva, for instance, moved away from all plastic packaging, went through, all the way to scope 1 and 2 of their supply chain, and forced an entire entirely different approach of delivering and packaging any goods. It cost us 4% to our cost P&L, which we passed on to the customer because that's why they choose Soneva.
Okay. Pablo.
I'll just say two quick things about that. The first is that we're moving away from gas in restaurants. And, you know, I think this is now largely accepted. So, you know, before it used to be a disadvantage marketing restaurant premises if there was no gas, but now a number of operators don't want it. So that's the good news. And then the other thing I would say is, as the owner of, sort of the previous owner of managed hotels in the UK, the legislation here environmentally is probably one of the most advanced I've come across, with things like MEES that require a certain EPC level by a certain date. You know, whether it's the right measure of sustainability is another question, but I have seen in the hotels that we have managed, CapEx be put in provision systematically to upgrade the hotels to meet those performance targets by 2030 or whenever.
Okay. David?
I unpopularly don't think it's why people pick hotels or restaurants. Let's go out for a meal, darling, and let's go to one that really doesn't cook on gas. It doesn't happen. It's not real life. Having said that, that could be an old man's view. I notice a passion in my younger managers to fit the bill on this, and they are the leaders of it.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary how some of them, it might be their kids, are saying, Dad, don't do this, don't do that. And it's seeping in, because it's a seeping process in buildings that cost 40 million quid each. But it is seeping in gradually and properly, certainly in the properties we control.
Yeah, I'm finding pressure from my grandchildren. Forget about children, it's let the generation. Andrew.
Our teams want us to do it. I disagree with David. I think some of our guests do, especially the corporates are expecting it now. So certainly the mice business expect it. You know, we're saving a lot of money by taking gas out of our kitchens and switching to electric kitchens, and they're making them much cleaner and healthier environments for our chefs. And yeah, I mean, I think the as Laura's done with the pig, and it's a well-trodden path in terms of that that sort of local sourcing is there's definitely a big demand for that in restaurants.
Okay. Sadly, we've reached the end of our journey, and I'm going to finish with a question that I would like you to answer in no more than one sentence and no more than one breath. So what one thing would you advise someone whose F&B profitability is currently impaired to focus on, so that the value of their hotel will have improved by the end of 2024? So they've got a year to do it. What one thing are you going to advise them to do to get their profitability up in the next year and their value up as a result? Pablo.
I would research on the local customer and have a targeted marketing for this particular audience.
Okay, thank you. David?
Close the restaurant and see what happens.
Andrew?
I would ask the team what they think and focus on a sales-focused culture for the team.
Okay, Laura?
Just strip it to the bare bones and the basics and see what happens.
Okay, amazing what people can fit into one breath. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists and in our previous speakers this morning. It's been a pleasure to bring this webinar to you, and I wish everybody a very happy Christmas, a wonderful last night of Hanukkah, if that's what you're observing, a very happy and prosperous new year, and may it be peaceful throughout the world. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Russell.
Thank you.